Okay, it's approved. It's approved. You're welcome.
Well, thank you. Absolutely.
Hey, any others guys?
There.
Right? Are you gonna test us?
There is a quiz at the end.
Yeah. Take good notes.
So much. Okay, we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting for Thursday, January 30th, 2025 at 5:30 p.m. at the Shop Station. We'll call the members. Ms. Crumley.
Mr. Roscoe,
Present.
Mrs. Cameron,
Present.
Mrs. Crumley, present.
All of that, the pledge of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I salute the flag of the state of Mexico, the symbol of perfect friendship among the United States.
Any changes to the agenda? Any public comments? On to action items, consideration of bus lease agreement.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Mr. President, members of the board, Superintendent Chavez. I am here today to request your approval on the bus lease agreement. And you recall from January's meeting, we did say that we'd be coming back to you all to amend Mr. Haynes's lease agreement to reflect the changes. Through this agreement, Mr. Haynes was renting bus 68, which is a DPS bus. This was the bus that belonged to the route in Columbus. And so when it was attrition to him in the 23-24 school year, we had this lease agreement to reflect the rental fees for that bus. And so now that he's received his own bus, bus 44, we're coming to you to amend this lease agreement and reflect those changes. So if you'll look on page 3, the total mileage is what changed and the total number of days for this school year. Instead of the full year, it'll only reflect him using it the first semester. Okay. And then the other minor change, which was just a technical thing, he requested that Mr. Deloitte Haynes be removed from the contract and only reflect his name, Brandon Haynes. And those are the only 2 changes that we see.
Any questions by the board? If none, I'll entertain a motion.
So that we approve the recommended changes.
Second.
I'll second.
Scrum?
Mrs. Cameron,
Yes.
Mr. Roscoe,
Yes.
Mrs. Crumley, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Rizal.
Thank you all.
That on to item 7, presentation,
Yes.
RBC Capital.
So do you mind if I just do a quick little kind of why we're doing this? Last, a couple of weeks ago, I think, or maybe it was December's updates, I shared with you how the tax structure was changing with the veterans program. And what we've been learning over this course of time, one is that we're going to be losing some funding potentially. And I shared it could be up to almost $500,000 if the worst case scenario happens, right? But in addition to that, we also just finished our F&P last summer. And part of that called for potentially a replacement of Bell Chaparral. There was a thought process around what we might do for that. And then longer term, we have a one-to-one technology program at the high school in Red Mountain has one. It's mostly kept at the school, but we also ensure that we have one-to-one devices for the Red Mountain students as well. And so we haven't had a funding mechanism for that. So I asked Kaylee to come and just share with you kind of where we're at in our bonding capacity, because right now we do not qualify for PSFA's highest match because of where we're at. So I think it's important that the board start learning so that you can make some decisions about where we go in the future and how we decide to fund schools and the facilities in the future. So
Absolutely.
Would you prefer me at the podium or here? It doesn't matter.
Well, do you wanna project? Did you bring a computer? Do you,
No, we
Okay.
just have the printouts, making sure everyone has a printout, right?
so do you want me to project or something for cause this is being broadcast? Or do you wanna put yours up? What do you wanna do? Okay.
You have the copy of the presentation?
I do.
Good.
What you sent us last
Yep,
week?
Same
That's what I have.
presentation. Yeah.
Can you talk about the PSFA match? The
Sure.
highest match, why don't we qualify for that, or what? how does
We
that
do
work?
qualify for basically wherever we're at right now, which I believe is 70-30. Does that sound right, Leslie? Fred?
7139.
71-39. Okay, so we do qualify for that. What we don't qualify, I guess I need to be over here, sorry.
She's moving that, the other thing to remember that does change. over time. That can be changed. It's something that is determined through the legislative session. And so right now, it's 7139 and go
61.
61.
When we did my little school,
My brain went.
yeah, so when we did my little school, our match was a lot higher initially, so it gets reevaluated, but there is a waiver, and that's what I'm referring to, is that PSFA has a waiver that when you meet a certain minimum in your bonding capacity, they'll actually do up to 90%, which means the local community only has to do 10%. So it is in our best interest to get to where we need to be at some point, which is $10 per assessed
Yes. It is a
100,000.
tax rate.
It's called a $10 tax rate. And right now, I believe we're at $8.20.
Yep.
She's gonna share all that with us, but we're not eligible for that waiver, which is the 90%, until we get to that number. So it's just something for consideration.
Okay.
Okay, so let me pull this. It's in PDF, so I'll have to just kind of scroll through.
Oh, all right.
Great.
Well, again, good evening, President, members of the board. My name is Keely Weimerster. I'm here tonight with my analyst, Carissa Stone. We're under contract to be the district's municipal advisors, essentially help you guys with your mill levy rates, your tax rate setting, and also your bonds too. And so again, we're here tonight to talk a little bit about that PSFA funding, but I mean, ultimately, the last time you went out to voters is back in 2021 for general obligation bond authorization. You know, we don't have any authorization left. The next time we're scheduled to go out to voters is this upcoming November, during the regular November election. So in the coming months here, the board is going to have to look at approving an election resolution to be able to go out to voters. And so my goal tonight is just kind of update the board both on all of the different pools of capital funding that are available to the district, how we kind of obtain those, and then also talking about the district specific plan of finance, along with some election discussions too at the end here. So with this being a work session, I'd like to be a little bit more interactive. You know, if you have any questions, let me know. If you want me to go over anything again, more than happy to also. So, you know, without further ado, I'll jump into it. First, starting at page 3, local sources of funds for capital improvements. So we can kind of group these into 2 different pots, right? The first one is the issuance of debt, which could be the issuance of general obligation bonds or the issuance of education technology notes. On the other side, we have capital mill levies. These are essentially pay-as-you-go sources. That could include SB 9 or HB 33. You know, all of these derive revenues off of property tax collections, but they all slightly differ. We'll go through each of them a little bit more in-depthly. So on our next page, we first start with that issuance of debt in general obligation bonds and education technology notes. So first, starting with general obligation bonds, these do require voter approval. You have to get authorization from the voters to issue GO bonds. You know, once we get that approval from the voters, it lasts for 4 years. So for example, if we go out this November in 2025, we get that election authorization. It's good to issue until November of 2029, lasts for 4 years. The maximum term of a borrowing is 20 years from the date of issuance, 20-year maturity. That's to be within the life of a lot of buildings and such. You know, as municipal advisors, so we don't like to try to issue over 20 years for interest cost reasons. You know, we usually try to shorten that up from anywhere from about 10 to 15 years.
the tax rate on GO bonds is set annually. And it's essentially set at whatever rate is needed to cover the outstanding principal and interest payments. That's essentially where we come in. We kind of figure out how much we need to sell in order to maintain a tax rate. Ultimately, the pledge of revenue, of course, is ad valorem taxes. The use of funds is general capital improvements. As for a borrowing amount limitation, state statute allows school districts to issue up to 6% of their assessed valuation. So in other words, if there is a school district that has $100 million tax base, 6% of that is $6 million. So that school district at any point could issue up to $6 million. For a little bit of perspective, Deming Schools is only about 55% bonded to capacity. And again, we set that tax rate annually. Now, going over to education technology notes, voter approval is not required, but districts can seek it if they would like. You know, it really just takes an action from the board to go forward with issuing education technology notes. But we do have a few districts across the state that go out to voters regularly for ETN authorization. Santa Fe Public Schools is a good example. They go out to voters every 4 years. They just have their own separate ETN program. Like GO bonds, if you get that authorization, it also technically lasts for 4 years. The maximum term of an ETN borrowing is only 5 years. That's to be within the useful life of TVs and computers and all the technology stuff. Like general obligation bonds, you know, the rate for education technology notes is set annually, and it is set out whatever rate is needed to cover the upcoming principal and interest payments. The general use of funds, of course, are education technology, and like general obligation bonds, ETNs are also subject to that 6% statute of limitations. So again, essentially, a school district can only be up to 6% bonded to capacity of their assessed valuations. That includes both general obligation bonds and education technology notes. And that concludes GOs and ETNs. After this, we're going to run into capital mill levies. So these are kind of pay-as-you-go sources. There is no issuance of debt in these, but rather it would be a school district levies a tax rate and then begins to collect funds immediately. So we have Senate Bill 9 and also House Bill 33. Senate Bill 9 or SB 9 is the most common one across school districts in the state. It's a basic 2 mill levy, so a $2 tax rate. Deming Schools has this in place also. The authorization for these lasts for 6 years. So once voters approve that tax rate is then in place for the next 6 years. The use of funds is generally capital improvements. It can also be education technology needs as long as that's disclosed on the ballot that voters approve. Looking over at House Bill 33, it's very similar to SB 9. The main difference being is the amount of the rate. So House Bill 33 can essentially be any tax rate, so as long as the district's overall tax rate does not exceed $15. So for example, let's say that there's a school district that has a $10 GO tax rate for $10, and then they also have that SB 9 tax rate for $2. Well, that would leave $3 left for HB 33 until that district would hit that $15 limit.
Really?
Yep.
And I just add real quick that the district does not have HB 33,
Correct.
we only have.
SB 9.
Yeah, only a handful of school districts do across the state. Farmington Schools, off the top of my head, is one of them. I think Los Lunas also. Not a lot of school districts do. SB 9 is a lot more common. Moving on. So we kind of talked about some of the pots of money. Now we're going to talk about how we get those pots of money. So talking with bond issuance planning steps. So for the typical initial planning steps, the first step, of course, is to determine the capital needs of the district. You know, it's really up to the district to kind of figure out what your needs are through your facilities master plan, stuff of that sort. Once you guys have an idea of how much you need, that's really when we come in, right? First, of course, we'll look and see if we need to hold a bond election. As your municipal advisors, we'll kind of do a tax rate impact analysis of what's the impact if we issue those bonds. You know, depending on that analysis, we might go out for more money, we may go out for less money. Generally, the strategy, though, is more of targeting a tax rate instead of an election amount, generally. You know, once we're ready to go out to voters, us and your bond council will create kind of like a time schedule that kind of marks all the approvals and filings that are needed to get onto that November ballot. During this time too, the district should be reaching out to your local community and really campaigning for these bonds, expressing their importance. Also as your municipal advisors, any sort of campaign materials you guys have, pamphlets, billboards, radio ads, stuff like that, definitely pass that through us so we can just make sure that everything's within compliance and okay. After the election, that's when we can finally, start to getting to issue the bonds. And that brings us to page 8, which are the different methods of bond sale. So first starting off with a public sale, a public competitive sale. This is essentially where we would just open up a bidding period. It's kind of like eBay. We open up a 30-minute period and we say, okay, whoever wants to buy the district's bonds at the lowest cost wins. We don't really look at who the purchaser is. It's just the lowest bidder wins. That's it. It's a quick process. A negotiated sale, on the other hand, it's also a public sale. We're in the public market, but we actually choose an underwriter ahead of time, and then they would sell the district's bonds on our behalf. Ultimately, if they're not able to sell the district's bonds, then they have to buy them themselves. We do negotiated deals really when markets are a little bit more uncertain. During the pandemic, we primarily did negotiated deals. And it's just because it's easier to take it day by day and to have that, face-to-face communication with an underwriter to figure out when's the best time to sell bonds. On the other hand, we have private placements or bank loans. This is essentially a sale that could be with the state treasurer's office or with the New Mexico Finance Authority. So the district all the way up until 2023 had been selling its bonds in a public process, sometimes competitive, sometimes negotiated. Starting in 2023, though, the district did sell its bonds through the New Mexico Finance Authority. And so on the next page, we just have kind of an NMFA versus a public sale comparison. Because there are pros and cons to each avenue, right? So the New Mexico Finance Authority, the biggest pro of it is honestly just the cost savings. When you go out to public markets, there's a lot of issuance costs associated with that. If you're going to go out to public markets, you have to get a bond rating with Moody's. At a minimum, that costs maybe $15,000 to $20,000. We have to create a preliminary official statement, which is kind of just this giant packet that markets the bonds to investors. That costs a good, $10,000 to $12,000. A paying agent fees also associated with it. The New Mexico Finance Authority doesn't need any of these things. Additionally too, if you go to the New Mexico Finance Authority, you're able to price your bonds underneath the New Mexico Finance Authority's bond rating of AA1, which is a couple notches higher than the district's A2 rating. So you also get a little bit better rates too. Additionally, the New Mexico Finance Authority, they have a disadvantaged program. And for the 2023 bond sale, the district did qualify for that. And really what that allowed us to do is to price 10% of that bond at a 0% interest rate. So all of those things combined, for your 2023 sale, we calculated that it was about 1.3% cheaper on an all-in true interest cost basis, or a total of about $700,000 of interest by going to the NMFA instead. It was a big deal. It was a big deal. It was a big deal, yeah. The biggest con though of going to the New Mexico Finance Authority is that they hold the funds. When we go to a public sale, once the bond's closed, the district gets the money in the bank immediately. But the New Mexico Finance Authority, they have a process that they hold the funds and then it's a requisition basis where you submit to them, a form and receipts. A lot of school districts do not like that process. They can be a bit frustrating to work with, I will say. It's a kind of a case-by-case basis for each district on which avenue they go through. Both of them are good avenues. They both have their own pros and cons. It's just kind of whatever fits you the best.
Why do they hold the money like that? Are they investing the money and?
Yeah, that is a part of it. To be frank, I'm not entirely sure. I think they just want to have a little bit of a closer eye on it because they're on the hook. They invested into it. With them being kind of a local entity too, they're a bit more involved in the local communities also. Yeah, I think it is a bit of a control thing.
We also do, though they invest it, but we do get those. The interest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An LGIP, right? All right. So moving on to page 10. So, after we issue bonds, we're not out of the woods. There are some things that we have to continue to do. The first of that is the spending of bond proceeds. Voters approved these bonds to go build projects. They didn't approve it to, sit in a bank forever and accumulate interest. So with that in mind, essentially districts have to commit at least 5% of the bond proceeds within the first 6 months And then 85% of bond proceeds must be spent out the door within the first 3 years, and then 100% within the first 5 years. Talking about the New Mexico Finance Authority, they actually have an internal policy that issuers must sell 100% of bond proceeds within the first 3 years. And again, this is to avoid any sort of arbitrage concerns. You know, should an issuer hold on to those bond proceeds for more than 5 years, they may be subject to an arbitrage rebate by the IRS and have to pay back the returns on those bond funds. You know, that's a rare case, though, I will say. In those situations, we know multiple arbitrage rebate consultants that we could connect you guys with, but I don't think you guys have ever had an issue with that. Additionally, updating bondholders and investors. So when you sell public bonds, by law, you have to annually update those investors on what's going on in the district. You know, every year the district posts a continuing disclosure undertaking, and all that does is really disclose to investors, you know, Deming Public Schools' enrollment rates, your tax base, stuff like that. You guys are contracted with AccuDisclose, who helps do those annual disclosures. But you know, should you only have private placed bonds, then you are not subject to that CDU. So, you know, at the moment, the district does have multiple public outstanding bonds, so you'll be required to continue to post those disclosures until all of those public bonds are no longer outstanding. All right, so moving on to debt and tax rate management. So here's just a little bit of an example, right? At the beginning, we talked about how, you know, the tax rate is set annually and it is set at whatever is needed to cover the upcoming principal and interest payments, you know, and that is dependent on your tax base also. So, you know, in this example here, we can see that the school district's debt service drops from $9.4 million down to $5.1 million. You know, in doing so, that would drop the tax rate down from $6 all the way down to $3.50. So on our next page here, we have some tax rate management options of how we can try to avoid these things, right? The first one would be bond cycling. Essentially, it's where we issue new debt as prior debt matures, keeping your overall debt service requirements level, and in return, it keeps your tax rate level. This is the most common method used across issuers across the state. You know, there's also refunding, refinancing, in very extreme cases, even restructuring debt, where we'll push debt out in the future in hopes that the tax base will catch up in the future. We had to do that with Lovington schools a few years ago, actually, because oil and gas values had dropped. And then we also have education technology notes, which we can talk a little bit more about too. So on slide 14, we have bond cycling. So again, the idea is that we issue new debt as the prior debt matures. That keeps your overall debt service level, so then it also keeps your tax rate level too. You know, there's a lot of additional benefits to this though, beyond just tax rate management. You know, districts like it because it does help with long-term planning. It creates a consistent stream of funding, so you kind of know what to expect, and it just makes it easier to plan. You know, for voters, it's nice too, because it means we're going back out to voters consistently. It kind of keeps them in the loop and know what to expect. Again, the most common plan or tax rate management tool that issuers use. Now on slide 15, we have education technology notes. And so we can do education technology notes really in two ways. We could do long-term notes that have that 5-year maturity, often part of a cycling program. You know, districts that have a stable tax base and some technology needs, you know, would benefit most from a long-term ETN program, such as Deming School. You know, on the other hand, we have short-term notes, which is essentially where we would just issue an overnight ETN, really just trying to manage that tax rate. It's almost like an emergency procedure. You know, we really only do the short-term ETNs for districts that have fluctuating tax bases. You know, that could be school districts with a lot of oil and gas. And also for school districts where they're at threat of their tax rate dropping and they don't have any GO bonds left to authorize. So on slide 16, we just have some visuals of kind of what this looks like here. So again, for that long-term note, you can see we are consistently levying an ETN tax rate along with GO bonds. And then on short terms, you can see that we kind of fill that ETN rate as needed to keep the overall tax rate level. And again, your taxpayers, they don't see if that tax rate is for ETN or GO. They just see that overall debt service tax rate. So our goal is to try to keep that overall tax rate level with a combo of both GO and ETNs. So on slide 17, we have more of an example of how to do short-term ETNs. Again, this isn't super applicable to the district, but essentially, let's say that there's a school district that they've had a $6.50 tax rate historically. It looks like that tax rate is going to drop down to $3.50. Instead of letting their debt service tax rate drop, they're going to go ahead and levy a $3 ETN tax rate on top of it. So that overall, it still looks like it's $6.50. Once the school district has that ETN tax rate in place, that district would then start collecting funds in its ETN debt service account. We collect funds throughout the year, all the way up until the summer. We would see how much we collected. Let's say we collected $500,000 in that ETN account. Well, we would then issue an ETN for $495,000, right below that total collection, right? And so we would then probably go to a private purchaser like the state treasurer's office, and we would just issue a one-night ETN. And the reason being is because your ETN collections can only be used to pay off an ETN. They can't be used on technology projects. But proceeds from an ETN can be used on technology. So we kind of do a switcheroo in order to switch those funds to being able to be spent on technology needs. Because we already have the repayment of the ETN in the bank, that's why it's outstanding for only 1 day. And in doing so, we convert those funds on, spendable proceeds. Again, not super applicable to the district because you guys have a stable tax base, but this is a maneuver we always have in our back pocket in case there's a risk that the district's, tax rate will drop. So here's just a tax rate setting timeline, it really begins starting on June 30th. That's when, the public education department starts reaching out with a form called the 955F. And really what that form does is that it asks, what is your current cash balance? And then, what are your debt service requirements coming up? And that's how they calculate what they think your tax rate should be. But then we kind of have an arm wrestling contest with PED for the next couple months to try to figure out what the tax rate actually should be. With this in mind, though, before we get to June 30th, we want to kind of make sure we have our strategy in place of, if we're going to issue bonds, how much cash do we have? We just try to kind of button everything up before we start that tax rate setting process with PED. Another important thing to notice too is that, we begin setting tax rates with PED in August, but we go out for election in November. So because of that, that's a year-long lag. So for example, let's say that this upcoming August, I go up to PED and I say, okay, Deming Schools wants to raise their tax rate by $2. And PED says, well, that's great, but they don't have any election authorization for that. So no, it's not going to happen. So we would have to wait until November to get that voter approval. And then the following August, I can then go to PED and say, I've got more bonds to issue. They want a tax rate increase. And then we could start that tax rate increase. Again, because of the process, there's about a year-long lag for a tax rate increase to take place. All right. So I'll pause there. We kind of went through everything.
Which is why we're starting now.
Yeah,
With this
yeah.
conversation.
Absolutely. Again, kind of went over the basics. Now we just want to talk specifically about Deming Schools and kind of what's going on with the district's plan of finance. So on our first slide here, we have your assessed valuation, right? This is your tax base. And we see it's comprised both of residential businesses, non-residential businesses, and also centrally assessed. So your residential values continue to be pretty strong. This is pretty typical for across the state as real estate market continues to be really hot. Your your non-residential has some fluctuations in it, but we're also seeing your centrally assessed values increase. And so centrally assessed values are things like utilities, railroads, pipelines, stuff like that. They're central businesses that are running through your school district's boundaries. On the way here, we saw a lot of power lines being built. That would be an example of centrally assessed value that would benefit the district.
What about like the solar farms? And the
Yeah,
wind farms?
stuff like that can definitely help too. So, your 5-year average growth rate is sitting at 1.6% and your 10-year average growth rate is sitting at 2%. To be conservative though, in case that growth doesn't keep up, and our financial plans, we're projecting that your AV only grows by about 0.5% for the next 5 years and then 1% thereafter, just to be conservative in case there's any fluctuations in your tax base. Now, the next slide, we have the constitutional amendment. It sounds like the superintendent kind of already updated you on that. Again, for all of our plans of finance, we are including, this impact. Again, very conservatively, we think that it could impact your assessed value by about 18 million or by about 2.7% of your assessed valuation. But again, this is using very, very conservative numbers. I don't expect it to be that bad, but we just want to play it safe.
Which translates to about $500,000
Yeah.
in revenue for us, correct?
Yeah, so you'll see that the election scenarios we have in the back of the book, we ran those before we knew that this was coming, and they were about $500,000 higher. Yeah. All right, so continuing on, history of school tax rates. So, you know, your district and every district levies an operational tax rate of 50 cents. The district also has that SB 9 rate in place that we had talked about, and you have historically levied a $5.75 general obligation bond tax rate. So your residential tax rate has been sitting at $8.25 for about the last 10 years. You know, our current plan of finance has been based on keeping your tax rates level, and will continue to do so unless we're told so otherwise. So looking at your current outstanding debt. You know, the district currently has $22,235,000 of general obligation bonds outstanding. You know, the district's outstanding debt service, that bar chart is a really good example of that bond cycling program. Again, you can see that the district's debt is structured to decline over time. Again, that's what allows us to layer in future debt issuances without that tax rate increase. You know, additionally, as your municipal advisors, we're always looking for potential refinancing opportunities for interest cost savings. You know, if you look at your average outstanding coupons, which range from, you know, only 2.5% up to only 4.10%. You know, in our current interest market environment, there aren't any refinancing opportunities, but that is something that we do keep an eye out for. You know, additionally too, you'll see your 2014 bonds are currently callable. And so that brings me to our next slide here. So, you know, back in September, the district reported that it had about $1.2 million in your GO debt service fund, right? We project that the district will collect about $3.5 million throughout 2025. Your debt service payment throughout 2025 is only about $3.6 million. So with all of this in mind, we're expecting that you guys will have a surplus cash balance of about $1.1 million. You know, instead of letting that $1.1 million sitting there, we're looking at potentially using it to pay off those 2014 bonds early for interest cost savings. Along with interest cost savings, it would also help us with our tax rate management plan with PED. Because again, our fear is that PED would see you have a lot of extra cash. We should drop your tax rate then. And again, we don't want that to do that. It's just confusing for your taxpayers, you know, to see your tax bill go up and down like that. So this is something we'll kind of keep an eye on, but you might see me again sometime in kind of the spring or summer, really depending on those collections and how they come in, we'll kind of decide if we go forward, you know, with redeeming that 2014 bond. All right, so that brings us to your overall debt management plan. So the district has SB 9 in place. It was last renewed in 2023. Again, SB 9 authorization lasts for 6 years, so that doesn't need to be renewed until 2029. You know, as I had mentioned, the district last went out to voters for GO bonds back in 2021 for a total of $5 million. We have since sold all of that authorization. You know, the upcoming election amount really, it's dependent on the tax rate goals of the district. As I had mentioned, for tax rate management strategy, our goal up until this point has always been to just keep your tax rate level until told otherwise. You know, that otherwise may now be going out for PSFA funding. And PSFA has a statute that requires school districts to levy at least a $10 residential tax rate in order to qualify for the funding. It doesn't mean you get it, but it gives you the right to go in front of PSEOC and ask for funding. So that would require essentially a $1.80 tax rate increase from the district. We have some election slide or scenarios in the back that kind of go over that. You know, the last thing on this slide is just your legal bonding capacity. You know, based off of your 2024 assessed valuation, the district could issue up to about $40 million. The district only has $22 million outstanding, so you're only 55% bonded to capacity. So you have plenty of legal capacity, but the reason why we haven't issued all of that is because of that tax rate capacity. You know, the more we issue, the higher tax rate is needed. So that brings us now to our election discussion, talking about 2025. And we have a few different options here, right? So our first scenario is no tax rate increase. We're going to keep that debt service tax rate at $5.75 so that your total residential tax rate continues to be $8.25. So we could go out to voters this upcoming November for $9.5 million with no tax rate increase. Now, alternatively, if we do want to look at increasing the tax rate by $1.80, in doing so, it would increase your GO debt service tax rate to $7.55, and in return would increase your total residential tax rate to $10.05. We have that 5 cents in there just as a little bit of a rounding buffer between us and PED. A $1.80 tax rate increase would increase the tax burden by $60 for every $100,000 of home market value. So let's say that you have a home that has a Zillow value of $100,000. Well, your taxes are going to increase by $60 for every $100,000. And that scales too. If you have a $200,000 house, it's $120, so on and so forth. In total, the annual tax impact for your total residential tax rate would be $335 annually. Now, the rest of our scenarios talk about a $1.80 tax rate increase, so that tax rate burden increase is the same. Looking over at scenario 3, we heard that you guys had some upfront demands for a $20 million election upfront. We are able to squeeze that into your plan of finance with that $1.80 tax rate. But if we do that, then elections down the road will have to be a little bit smaller until that larger $20 million election upfront matures. And
So I think it's important that's if we were to build a school, that is what would be needed, because schools right now, brand new schools, elementary schools are about $56 million right now. It's just gone insane we built the whole high school for about 60 million, and now that's what an elementary school costs. So that's why we asked her to run the scenario that way. If we went that direction in terms of building an elementary school, replacing an elementary school. So you would see that.
And though really just kind of concludes our GO bond election only scenarios. On our next page, we do a little bit of a mix with GO and ETN. So let's say we don't increase the GO tax rate at all. We're able to go out for that $9.5 million again. And instead we see the tax rate increase for education technology notes. We would go ahead and levy a $1.80 education technology note. And that would allow us to ask voters for $4,350,000 for technology needs. Again, it would increase your total residential tax rate to that $7.55, increasing your total residential tax rate to $10.05. The increase of tax burden is also $60. It's all the same. And then scenario 5 does kind of a blend of both of them. We would increase our GO tax rate by 80 cents. And that would give us $11.5 million GO elections. And at the same time, we would also ask voters for a $1 ETN tax rate. That would allow us to go out for $2,350,000 of ETNs. So we kind of do a blended rate of both GO and ETN in these scenarios. Again, no scenario is better than the other. None of them are bad either. It's just whatever suits the district's needs the best. Yeah, the back of the presentation just has a plethora of information that I will not bore you with. That really does kind of conclude the bulk of my presentation. I know this is supposed to be a bit more of a discussion. So, if you have any questions about any of these scenarios, I'm more than happy to kind of go further in depth on them.
That 55% bonded to capacity, is that just a typical rate across the state that we want to stay in that 55%?
So for PSFA purposes, honestly, it doesn't matter. PSFA.
Should that 10?
Yeah, so the $10 tax rate is what is in state statute. That is a requirement. I will say though that PSCOC, the board who would approve your waiver, I've seen them kind of look over at school districts' bonding capacity. I think you guys are definitely fine being around 55%. I feel like PSCOC becomes a little annoyed by it if it's like only a 10 or 20% bonded to capacity. Really what? Okay.
So if you look at page 31, I think it's important to see the comparables of other districts to kind of, to your point, Mr. Oroso, I think you can see where other school districts are in terms of not only their assessed valuation, but also their current debt rate. We're one of the lower districts in the state, in terms of what we have in debt service tax. So we're not the highest, we're not the lowest, but we're kind of in the middle right now. But I don't think there's a number regarding percentage of debt, right?
No.
Didn't do that comparable.
Again, 55%'s I'd say a healthy average, quite normal, yeah. Additionally too, with how expensive building costs are becoming, we are seeing more and more districts relying on PSFA funding and that waiver. I've had several meetings in the last month about raising tax rates in order to get that PSFA waiver too. Multiple school districts are now looking at raising their tax rates.
Yeah. Definitely interesting.
From a timing standpoint too, we don't have to make a decision tonight. That election resolution, we would want to approve it at the latest in July. Honestly, though, the sooner the better. Whatever gets filed first with the county clerk gets higher up on the ballot. And just kind of investor psychology, voters are more likely to approve things at the top of the ballot instead of the bottom.
But we have to do that regardless of regardless of going increases or staying the same, we still have to go out again this year, even stay the same.
Yep, and that, to at least maintain your current tax rate too.
And the ETN bond, that's just for to purchase electronics, or how does that, what's the
Yeah.
parameters?
It
for
can also
this?
be infrastructure, security cameras.
So slide 33 has the statute. It's quite vast. So for that new school, like some ETN funds can fund some of the things that would be needed into that new school. Some school districts, again, security cameras, fire alarms, intercom systems, stuff of that sort.
And for example, I want to say it's around $500,000 to go to the upgraded fire systems now.
Yeah.
Because they have to be voice activated, and we have schools that don't have voice activation because they were built, back. So as this kind of funding helps to replace those infrastructure items too.
There could be some potential cost savings with that if it's part of a larger project, but in general,
Right.
that's kind of what it's gonna cost.
Yeah.
And of course, it depends on the size of your facility. There's a big
course.
difference between the school for 200 and is for 650 or something like that. Even larger facilities are made for 1,200, substantially larger.
Most systems, I'm sure, will last for a long time.
Whatever, don't touch them.
5 years.
Yeah, all those companies kind of build in a like. Oh, I see you. It's over.
Network cards just go out right after the 5th year.
Yeah, how convenient.
So the way I was thinking in terms of what needed to happen first was kind of getting this background around the bonding, where we're at, kind of thinking around like funding sources and understanding that. And then let's come back. I think we need to come back and look at the FMP, the facility master plan, and the facility needs, and start really identifying those really big projects and figure out like, okay, how do we want to do that? How do we want to prioritize them? And then how do we want to fund them? Talk about the schools specifically, potentially replacement. Again, a work session I think would be, and then taking this information and thinking about, okay, do we need to do an increase? Do we not? And just trying to do a work session. We can have construction here and work through that as well. That was my thinking, but we're open to, what do you guys think? What do you want to do?
I think that's a good plan. I think this is a good start. I don't know anything about this. So
Right.
this is a good start for me, being new for sure. So I'm processing.
Well, and I
It's
think
a lot.
including the others are very important.
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I thought the funding piece was most important to start with, and then we can really dig into the facility pieces. Because if we go school, if we decide to replace a school, and I can tell you Chaparral is in desperate need of replacement. We also might need to look at redistricting, like that could lead to a whole other discussion. And
Yeah,
so
I think I remember there being some sort of presentation that says things are not being used.
Right.
efficiently.
Exactly. So that could lead to a whole new thing. So I thought this was the first step. Then we need to plan to meet on the facility side of things.
That definitely.
Yeah.
Stuff to chew on.
It's a lot to chew
Yeah.
on. You can dream about it tonight.
Yeah.
And if you have any questions after this too, feel free to reach out to myself or any of my colleagues. Yeah, more than happy to help out and even come back too. Absolutely. I'm always happy to come to Deming.
Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate you guys being here.
One question before you step up. As you work with other districts, and I mean, the cost of construction is going up. Ultimately, this would be the way to go to try to hit that 10% threshold.
Yeah.
What those districts who are experiencing, they don't have the capacity to do that. Construction costs are out of the realm. I mean, what are they choosing to do it now?
Ultimately, it's PSFA funding is starting to become the only way that school districts can get their tax rate. Last year Hagerman schools increased their tax rate by $3. And it's because, they were levying a $7 tax rate, but their tax base was so small that was only allowing, $2 million elections. That it just doesn't work. So ultimately they had to go to PSFA and now they get their new school. But ultimately they had to rip that Band-Aid off with their local community
And get to
and
the
just have that
10.
tax rate increase.
And then they were able to go.
Yeah. And again, with your communications with the community, also you can explain to them of, yes, it's a $1.80 tax rate, but it unlocks all of this additional money for this larger project. That's definitely okay to communicate to your voters.
And that would be okay for like multiple projects, because I know there are a lot of districts have multiple schools
Yeah.
that they're up on the Fed, right? So they're up for.
Yeah, and so again, PSFA has like a ranking list
Yeah.
of all of each individual school property and kind of where they at on their list of needs. And Chaparral is pretty high up there. Yeah.
Bell is
Bell's
higher. Bell is higher because when the district approved, and it was way before all of us, approved to build the multipurpose room, it pushed Chaparral down on the list. It just upgraded them to a point where it just, unfortunately, and it has now put us in a bind because their main facility is so much in need of a lot of work. And if we invest the money in it, then that makes it even, that will push it further down and we won't be able to replace it. And that building it's 50 years old. That's about the life of a school is 50 years.
Yeah.
So we have to think about all those things, and you guys have to think about all those things. So we have to decide what the right priority is and what direction we'll go.
Additionally too, I know we talked about the tax rate setting and how there's kind of a year lag for that tax rate to take effect. The way I've been working with PSFA is that, start discussions with them when you guys know that you're wanting to go out for that tax rate increase, kind of keep them in the loop. When they see that voters approve that tax rate increase, then they've allowed us to go forward with that funding with the promise that, next year the tax rate will increase. So, even though we won't see that new tax rate hit the rolls until, November of 2026, you could start getting funding way sooner than that with the PSFA. Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's push and pull effects too, because I mean, you get your counties and your cities that people are like, I don't want to see tax increase because my roads aren't good, and I don't want to see a tax
Right.
increase because
Yeah.
what have you done with my money? And so sometimes it almost, when they go to vote, it's like, well, I'm gonna vote no for everything because I
Right.
don't see a benefit.
Yeah.
And so sometimes there's people that are outliers that kind of suffer because they just said no.
Well,
Sure.
if you're in a high retirement community too.
Yeah,
Mhm. And I think that happened here when.
it did.
It does, and it has,
It
it has, sure. The message is really important for sure in getting out there.
Messaging is important, and to be frank too, school districts only go out on odd numbered years, which is nice because that's not during general elections. Folks who come in and vote, they have to really care to come in on an off year in 2025, you know what I mean?
It's true.
Generally, regular November elections on odd number years have a higher likelihood of passing. Yeah. But it might be a bit, like I said, a lot of retirement community here. It will be a little bit of an uphill battle. But I mean, again, as long as the district campaigns, you guys are able to explain of yes, the $1.80 tax rate increase, but unlocks these millions of dollars of funding in order to do so. We've seen that strategy be pretty successful with school districts across the state. And like I said, too, we're more than happy to kind of help out with that too. Yeah,
It's a benefit here as well as Deming because we're a large employer, right? So they work for the district, they benefit, from it, the students come here, parents see it, so it will be,
yeah.
it helps to showcase that, let them know what we've currently done, how it will continue to kind of support that experience for kids. So it'll be quite a campaign to be able to do to offset that. But it's one of those of every teacher goes out and votes and every parent goes out and votes with their children in school, it helps quite a bit. And that's the way I've seen most districts be successful.
Yeah.
Any questions on the board?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate that.
Appreciate it.
Like I said, if you have any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always happy to just hop on a call. And I'm always happy to come back to Deming too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On to announcements, any board member requests for agenda items? If not, the next board meeting, or I'm sorry, the board will be traveling to Santa Fe, New Mexico, February 12th to the 15th, 2025, to attend New Mexico School Board Association Conference. The next regular meeting will be held February 20th at 5:30. The meeting will be held in Columbus Elementary, 7450 Altuda Road, Southeast in Columbus, New Mexico. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. Mr. Roasted,
Yes.
Mrs. Larmen.
Yes.
Yes.